Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, student debt cancellation has been the focus of a great deal of attention recently because it is one of a short list of action items Biden can actually implement without soliciting votes from Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. It's not because it's the program that helps the neediest. It's not even the way I'd address the student loan crisis if I had my druthers. We need to address the cost of college by making public colleges and universities tuition free. And heck, if I had my way, we'd also be offering retroactive payments to folks who've paid off their debts. But I don't run the world, unfortunately, and Biden is limited to doing what he can do using executive authority, which means student debt cancellation. Because over 90% of student debt is held by the federal government, he can use the same authority, which has enabled him and Trump to pause student debt, to cancel it outright. Over 44 million Americans have student debt, including a growing number of seniors, people exploited by for-profit colleges, and folks with debt from vocational degrees. Republicans and corporate Democrats have limited Biden's ability to provide relief to other populations in other ways. Say you're someone who would prefer to see aid go into families. I might agree. But with $225 billion in child care canceled, $225 billion in paid family leave canceled, and $200 billion in universal pre-K all killed along with the human infrastructure bill, the best we can do for families is make sure that parents in those families aren't still paying their loans off as they save for their children's education. Now, the news this week is that it seemed for a second that Biden was actually coming around on this. After months of pretending he didn't have the authority to do what he was already doing, this week it was reported that Biden told the Congressional Hispanic Caucus that he's considering significant student debt cancellation, leading some to hope that not only was Biden finally getting serious about his campaign promise to cancel at least $10,000 of debt for everyone, but that he might actually cancel $50,000 or more. Now, his administration is already walking this back, but not soon enough to prevent all of the most corrupt big bank shills on Twitter from squealing like stuck pigs all day yesterday. Let's run through some of the worst takes, shall we? First up, founder of one of the world's leading private equity firms, 2012 presidential hopeful, and owner of an elevator for his cars, a real man of the people, Mitt Romney. Romney trended on Twitter yesterday for tweeting, quote, "Desperate polls call for desperate measures. Dems consider forgiving trillions in student loans. Other bribe suggestions? Forgive auto loans, forgive credit card debt, forgive mortgages, and put a wealth tax on the super rich to pay for it all? What could possibly go wrong?" What could go wrong? Not much from my perspective. Sounds like a good plan. Now, thoroughly dissecting everything wrong with this tweet would make this script longer than Grey's Anatomy, but let's just start with the obvious. Everything he describes here is good and should happen. Making good things happen for working people is not a bribe. That's just good politics. So, for example, credit card companies have been notoriously exploitative, and progressives like Bernie Sanders and AOC have proposed legislation to keep banks, like the ones Romney served when he was making his millions, from exploiting consumers with hidden fees and usurious interest rates, which average a whopping 17.71%. Mitt Romney is the kind of person who sees bailing out consumers as a problem, even while he's mum on the federal bailouts he's received. He tut-tuts helping students who can deduct a maximum of $2,000 of student loan interest from their taxes, and only then if you make under $60,000 a year, even while he can deduct the full interest on his $1 million home. It's good, apparently, when the laws are designed to cut the rich a break, but God forbid working families get the same benefit. As rising guest Andrew Perez pointed out, if forgiving student debt was a massive giveaway to the rich, politicians would have done it already. This caller into C-SPAN this week put it perfectly.
But I have a different take on this.
Okay.
I think student loan debt should be wiped out for this reason. 2 years ago, they passed the Paycheck Protection Program in Congress. Businesses, which are people, they got billions of dollars. Then they used them billions of dollars, which wasn't their money, to pay their workforce for 6 months, and then it was extended. They turned around and forgave their debt, and they also let them keep all their profits. So why is it good enough for the business but not good enough for the student? That's my question. That's called fairness and equality.
Adam Minsky. Well said, sir. Well said. Now, to be clear, Romney's far from the only hypocrite in the bunch. Tom Cotton, self-styled working man's hero, asked, quote, why should a trucker who didn't go to college have to pay off a lawyer's student loan debt? But if he knew anything about trucking, he'd know that student debt is a problem for truck drivers too. Did you know that the vocations corporate conservatives pretend to respect often require real training, and that training costs money? Did you know that the average truck driving school requires folks to pay between $3,000 and $7,000 up front, and that's not including housing, meals, and transportation? Cotton doesn't want to pay for truckers to get an education, so he's pretending that they will be paying for a lawyer's degree. But the reality is, of course, that nobody is paying in a traditional sense. What we're talking about is federally held debt being canceled. You know how no one is paying right now because of the student debt moratorium? Cancellation simply means that status quo is made permanent. And to the extent that anyone should pay to permanently fix the underlying problems with the system by making public education and vocational programs free, well, let's revisit one of the excellent suggestions from Romney's tweet: tax the rich. Remember, Elizabeth Warren's modest wealth tax involved a 2-cent tax on every dollar earned over $50 million in wealth. Just 2 cents on a dollar over 50 million. If a billionaire dropping $44 billion on an app doesn't suggest to you that a modest wealth tax is in order to make sure we have a well-educated populace that can, actually help build the Mars colony we're all dreaming about, I'm not sure what will. Now, finally, here's my favorite take, this time offered up by another faux populist, JD Vance, a man dripping with so much contempt for poor white people that even the great Glenn Close couldn't reform the movie adaptation of his life story. Now, according to Vance, forgiving student debt is a massive windfall to the rich, to the college educated, and most of all, the corrupt university administrators of America. Okay, now, if there were ever an argument to fund free public college and hobble private institutions like Yale, Vance's alma mater, this complete turd of bad logic Vance is dropping here is it. Now, I want you to really lean in, really listen to what I'm about to say. I think you'll get it intuitively. Rich people don't take out debt to go to college. Rich people don't have to. Think about it. Interest rates when I was going to law school were about 8%. Why on earth would anyone who could pay the sticker price for school, about $180,000 at the time, sign up for an interest rate that would have them pay over $80,000 more than the cost of tuition over the course of an average 10-year repayment period? And to be clear, most people take much longer than 10 years. Millions of Americans who happen not to have rich parents are paying more for their education than the kids whose parents can pay up front. Vance's argument ends up amounting to saying, I only think that rich kids should become doctors and lawyers. I only think rich kids should get a 4-year degree. And that's not the populist egalitarian argument he thinks it is. That's the argument of someone who got the benefit of a Yale education and wants to pull the ladder up behind him. That is an argument you should ignore. Now, Biden's latest remarks do seem to be a departure from what he said in the past, and I understand why folks are hopeful. But I am a student of Biden logic, and Biden historically subscribes to the school of reverse empathy, e.g., it was tough for me, so it should be tough for you too. During the campaign, in a move that I found to be shocking in its cruelty, he used his deceased son's medical bills as a justification for why we shouldn't have Medicare for all. He is an expert in weaponized empathy, using the fact that he can relate to voters through shared tragedy to justify not doing all he could to help them. This is why student debt cancellation advocates should not let up now. This is the moment to put the pressure on. The fact that all of these corporate-funded politicians who suckle at the teat of big banks are squealing means activists, workers, students, and their parents have finally turned up the heat. Private loan servicers, banks, and others who are making a profit off of this regressive education tax are lobbying politicians hard to keep this corrupt system in place. And the government has an interest in keeping education and healthcare out of reach so it can continue to drive young people into the armed forces, not out of a sense of duty or patriotism, not because they believe we are fighting just wars, but because they don't know how else to get healthcare or to go to school. Tom Cotton and Romney are right. There is a class war afoot, but it's not being waged between lawyers and truckers. It's millionaire investment firm founders, come politicians, against you in your children's future. Now, Robbie, I got to say I had a good time on the internet yesterday because anybody who knows me knows that I love talking about student debt. And when we're having these active conversations, because so many politicians wigged out yesterday on the internet, it reveals a lot of the faulty thinking afoot that's been parroted and kept these kind of policies under the radar for years.
The point of this, where I do agree with you, the kind of like the Romney tweet, the kind of what are we going to do now? Bail out all these things. Because some of that, we have done that. Like we did bail out the auto industry.
Yes.
We've bailed out, rich, the too big to fail banks, all that. Now, I was against all those policies, so I think I'm being consistent. But I see why someone of a progressive bent would say, well, the government makes it work, helps out all these other more rich and powerful, these industries. There's all sorts of subsidizing going on and helping. And if they screw up, they get a loan. They get a bailout, so I get why there would be a little bit of, okay, but not for...
Yes, businesses to the point of the caller into CNN, so much of the PPP funds, banks made a huge profit on all of that.
But again,
also the middle class. So many politicians are allergic to saying working class or poor. You never hear politicians talking about the working class or poor. When people are running for election, they talk about their benefits that they're going to give to the middle class. All of a sudden, the left, we always want to talk about the working class and poor. We always want to talk about the fact that 40% of Americans can't come up with a $400 for an emergency, much less $7,000 for trucking school. But the second any policy can touch the middle class from the left's perspective, suddenly all of these middle class people, the doctors and lawyers that are normally the focus of so much attention from elite Democrats and Republicans alike, the Schumers of the world who say for every working class vote we'll lose, we'll pick up one in Connecticut or whatever. All of a sudden it's anathema to want to help people who are making $100,000 a year. Now, do I think that, as I said up top, should be the priority of political focus? No, and obviously the overwhelming majority of people who have student debt don't make that much money. And they try to make, someone like me, the poster child for who's going to get helped here. But it's also worth pointing out that the government picks winners and losers all the time and has rigged the system in many ways to benefit the middle class in a way that has left other people behind. So to the mortgage interest point, I was livid when I discovered, after starting to pay back my student loans, that if I were to have bought $1 million house, now the numbers have been revised to $750,000. Oh, restraint. But if I were to have bought a $750,000 house, I could write off that entire interest amount on my taxes. Now, if I have a $750,000 or a $180,000 student loan, I can write off a maximum of $2,000 of that on my taxes. The system is rigged over and over again to give tax breaks for kids and tax breaks for people to buy homes. And I'm not against that, even though I do not have a home. I do not have any kids. But for some reason, it's completely normalized to have a very selfish, narrow perspective when it comes to student debt, as though the same incentives to get an educated workforce don't exist as to encourage people to have kids, to encourage people into home ownership.
Right. I mean, I would quibble with some of I think we have overly encouraged having an educated workforce to the detriment of actually having a workforce, because everyone has to go to college for so long and get themselves into debt, and there's a kind of credentialism to it. I agree with that 100%. I think that we need to have free public colleges and universities, because the hierarchical system that people like JD Vance are trying to maintain, a Harvard degree, a Yale degree doesn't mean anything if everybody can go. The whole system is built on exclusion, and the costs play into that. But I do think everyone should have an opportunity to go either to college or vocational school if that's what they want. And the decision whether to go or not to go should not be based on how rich your parents are, because that's a way just to entrench our class hierarchies. And nobody should be sitting around saying, I think only Joe Biden's kids get to go to Penn because he gave some big donation there and has an honorary chair. If you have a problem with Penn, let's get rid of Penn. I'm all for abolishing the Ivy League, which is going to make me really popular at my reunion this year. It's going to make you popular with some conservatives who say the college endowment should be seized. And look, I'm all for it. Harvard having more money than most countries in the world is a real problem, especially since they're still charging kids tuition, which is what I tell people when they call me to see if I want to donate to the alumni fund every year. Just ignore the alumni fundraising pitch this year, please. All right, well, we'll have more Rising after this. Stick around.